We're now joined by Chief News anchor Kieran Gilbert. Kieran, the report found she breached ministerial standards.
Danica, that's right, by basically a perceived conflict of interest. With me, our political editor, Andrew Clennell, as well. And Andrew, the writing has been on the wall for well over a week now. As you reported back on the 23rd of January, she was going to go. They've gone through the process. Has she got a fair deal?
Well, it's a laborious process. She obviously doesn't feel she has got a fair deal, but obviously many of us believe that we were always destined to get to this point. Since the 22nd, there was that dinner at the Lodge with Michael McCormack, the Deputy Prime Minister, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg and the Prime Minister. They weren't just eating Turkish pizza, we knew that. And the expectation was this Gaetjens report was set up to produce a result. Not in the first item that the PM mentioned where there wasn't apparently a problem, which is the sports rorts generally. If there was a problem there, the whole government would have a problem. But on this second item around the gun club declaration, Bridget McKenzie's released a statement, Kieran. She's pretty defiant there. She says, I accept the Prime Minister and Cabinet report in relation to my previous role as a sports minister. But, she says, I maintain that at no time did my membership of shooting sports clubs influence my decision-making, nor did I receive any personal gain. However, acknowledge that my failure to declare my membership's timely manner constituted a breach.
And this was the Wangaratta Clay Shooting Club. There was another membership as well that Phil Gaetjens, the Secretary of the Prime Minister's Department, alluded to in saying that there should have been greater transparency in terms of these memberships. But she's adamant, as you say, defiant on the way out from Cabinet, that this did not influence her decision-making when it came to the grants. Yes, but
I mean, like, from my opinion, if you believe that, you believe anything. And I think, you know, the Prime Minister's found that. That other grant that the Prime Minister mentioned there was the Northern Territory Game Association. It was 500 grand. You know, the Wangaratta one was 35 grand. This was 500 grand. And I believe it was one of those ones given after in a situation our whistleblower spoke to us about, which was she'd gone to visit the seat of Solomon. Kathy Ganley came back and suggested that a grant be found. That sort of aligns with that. He was talking then about the fact that she was a member of umbrella shooting organisations, made a conflict for her she should have declared when awarding the grants, and that's what's got her in the end.
Very interesting difference here, wasn't there, between what Phil Gaetjens found about the overall report. He said roughly there were a similar percentage that went to Coalition as Labor seats, but very different to what the Auditor-General found, wasn't it, which was picked up in a couple of those questions at the news conference, because really, obviously, the thing that got her were those two memberships, the Wangaratta Clay Club and the Northern Territory Game Association. But the overarching structure of it and whether or not it was swayed one way or the other, Gaetjens didn't endorse the Auditor-General report that this was totally a political program.
Yeah, and look, he's the Secretary for the Prime Minister, that's the thing. I mean, he was ultimately going to find what the Prime Minister wanted him to find, let's face it, and you wonder why it took 10 days to do so.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's recap what the Prime Minister had to say, particularly when it came to that perceived conflict of interest, and this was a little of what he said at the news conference on that front.
On the basis of that, and that is the conflict of interest and the failure to disclose, the Minister has tendered her resignation to me this afternoon, and I want to say a couple of things about that. Minister McKenzie has shown a great respect for the Statement of Standards. She has honoured that Statement of Standards and the decision that she has taken today by offering her resignation to me this afternoon. I want to thank Bridget McKenzie for the outstanding job she has done in serving both in my Cabinet and my predecessor's Cabinet.
Yeah, the Prime Minister very complimentary, wasn't he, about Bridget McKenzie as she walked out the door, saying she's been very committed, and you get the sense that he said to her privately, you do have a chance of coming back at some point. This is not, you know, for all time. This is a step back in your career, but you can return. think that that must have been an olive branch that is extended as she's walking out the door, basically.
As you've seen with Stuart Robert, as you've seen with Susan Lee. And how else do you get them to resign, Kieran? Because otherwise you have to blast them out, because she still believes from her statement she did nothing wrong. So if he doesn't extend that olive branch, she wouldn't have resigned. The interesting thing about that, and I guess we've seen these sorts of things before, full of praise for someone who's effectively sacking. If there's going to be blowback out of this, it's going to happen anyway. You know, you can praise them as much as you want. The outcome's the same. Bridget McKenzie loved that job. She loved the power of that job. You know, to be Deputy Nationals leader as a woman was a massive thing for her. It's a huge blow for her today, and she'll be blaming Scott Morrison wholly and squarely for it.
Oh, yeah, well, this is from Scott Morrison. This is not a decision by the Nationals leader, Michael McCormack. That is not... We should make this clear. This is not a decision by the Nationals leader, and as a senior National put it to me earlier, that they serve as ministers at the request of the Prime Minister. So if the Prime Minister loses faith in a minister, they've got to rework their arrangements. That's basically it. But this is not from McCormack. So those within the Nationals that wanted him to push McKenzie out, he has not done that.
But how does that look for McCormack? Does he look weak? Does he look like he should have stood up to the Prime Minister? Even those who don't like Bridget McKenzie will be pushing that argument in undermining McCormack. That's the fear from him. Having said that, I haven't heard any suggestion of a leadership spill. The Nats just don't do it. It's just David Littleproud gets another notch up in terms of becoming deputy leader. Just another thing on the seats, Kieran. We're talking about the Labor seats and the marginal seats that Gaetjens found no problem with. We remember that former staffer who spoke to us actually said that the number of Labor seats awarded grants was an attempt by the minister to cover their asses after warnings were given to the then Chief of Staff that it was inequitable. So, you know, the Gaetjens finding on that, it lacks a little bit of credibility, I think.
Well, yeah, as you said, and as you reported during the week, that was done post-fact. That was done with the knowledge that they were going to start copping flack. So let's find some Labor seats, basically, is the way it worked. But let's go back to the fundamentals here. Does this stem the bleeding ahead of the first parliamentary week for 2020? They've done it, the Prime Minister, on two fronts. They've sought to stem the bleeding. One, by chopping McKenzie from Cabinet. The second one is by adopting recommendation 4 of the Auditor-General, which, without going into too much detail, basically requires a minister to provide more detail, an explanation, to be transparent when they overrule a statutory body like Sport Australia. Will that work, those two moves?
Yeah, it means the department will now have a record of why ministerial discretion was used.
And an explanation every time.
Exactly. Yeah. But, I mean, whether that stops rorting remains to be seen. At the end of the day, departments work for ministers. They're going to do what they're told. Does it stem the bleeding? Well, it stems some of the bleeding. He would have been under immense pressure to sack McKenzie for another 2 weeks and then probably would have had to do it. He'll still come under a lot of pressure and question time the next 2 weeks. It's a question of whether, you know, the opposition runs out of steam or whether there's more revelations or whether other issues like coronavirus trumpet as they become perhaps more serious issues.
Yeah, indeed, it's a good point because we've got so many of those other issues bubbling away. One of the other things we should factor in is that this starts not just an instability within the coalition, but the Nationals particularly. We know that there are 2, 3 factions, maybe more within the National Party room. They're only a party room of a bit over 20. But does this start a situation of bloodletting, or can McCormack keep the show together?
Well, the next test is the Nationals Party room. I don't know if it changes after today, but all the talk was it was Tuesday. They'll be hoping for sort of a bloodless situation, which I foreshadowed last week, Littleproud Deputy, Matt Canavan Senate Leader, maybe enough people, you know, Darren Chester, who's more on the McKenzie side, into Cabinet. Maybe if enough people are rewarded, there's not so much of a problem there. It's unclear whether another Nat would come into the outer ministry, maybe not, but if so, that would be a woman. But, you know, a small party room, four extra people get jobs. Maybe that's enough for now. I don't think there's any doubt McCormack's been weakened by this whole saga, Kieran.
Indeed, and the government more broadly, how damaging has it been in your view? I spoke to Paul Kelly on our program this morning, Sunday Agenda. He was scathing in terms of the impact that this has had on the standing of the government and that it was chipping away at the Prime Minister's own credibility as well. He's dealt with it. Some would say belatedly, but it's done, and he has put a process in place via the Secretary of his department, the report of which he only received this weekend.
Well, he would have been smashed if he didn't act on it, so at least he's done that. But, you know, we'll have a news poll tonight or tomorrow morning, so we'll know from that. We know the last one had his disapproval rating at a huge 59%. Together with the fires and some stumbles there, it's just a perfect storm for Scott Morrison, really. Of course he can recover, big time. Lots of Prime Ministers have had bad times and recovered, but he needs a solid 6 months. He wouldn't want things to keep going wrong like this, and he doesn't want any more oxygen in this saga. He doesn't want senior ministers dragged in. You know, you've heard that there have been representations from the likes of perhaps Frydenberg or Dutton or Porter, or at least they got grants. Were there representations? Did Bridget McKenzie act on those? They'll probably be getting questions. The PM and the role of his office, that'll be scrutinised.
Yeah.
He must have enough confidence he's in the clear there in order to act. So you have to come to that conclusion.
And when you look at a political party, the Labor Party, the opposition, they now, in terms of their tactics, their strategy tonight, tomorrow morning, it's basically McKenzie to one side now. That's done. She's gone. That's a scalp. Let's turn our attention. Who's the next scalp? And they are going to use the Senate inquiry to target, as you say, ministers, but also the Prime Minister's office to try and dig as much dirt and throw as much dirt as possible. And that, even with the axing of Bridget McKenzie, is the backdrop for the first sitting week, isn't it?
And you couldn't have dreamt it up. If I said this to you 6 weeks ago, you would have said, what are you on? You know, it's just incredible how fast politics moves. A week's a long time, you know, the usual cliche, but suddenly we've got a scandal-hit government. What happened? And it was something in the background always building. People in government would have known this was coming. And, you know, I don't know if they knew the ferocity of it.
Well, indeed. And now, as you mentioned this morning, as Paul Kelly said as well, everything needs to be seen in the context of the way the Prime Minister responded to the fire situation and copped flack for being indecisive and not showing enough leadership in the face of the fires. And I guess this is another one to be seen in that context, isn't it?
Well, you saw him have a sort of shot at that argument. I mean, we had some commentary this morning. Has he got a problem with indecision? You know, we said fires, then Palaszczuk hooks into him over the coronavirus, but then he does act swiftly, and this has just taken far too long, in my opinion. He should have acted on this a week ago. It was always going to be the same result.
Andrew Clennell, our political editor, we've got a big week ahead, first sitting week for 2020. Thanks for your analysis.
Look forward to it.
Appreciate it.